Get the mic back there. God is going to get it. Welcome to everyone to the class. If you have your Old Testament, go ahead and be turned to the book of Obadiah. That's where our study is taken from. I'll get the mic working here. And it may be some stuff, it may not be. I don't think you turned this one on here. I mean, there's no on button, I don't think. We have the wrong one? Still not. I don't know if we have. For the online folks, it's working or just do it without it. Let me push this to the side and I'll just use the other. It does. I don't know that we can pull it. Let me just try this. Got professional there. Now I switched to maybe we have to switch this back. He got it. Right now we're ready to go. We had some audio problems there. I think Seth got those corrected for us. Thank you, Seth. One of the purposes of studying the Old Testament in Romans 15 verse 4, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning. The great advantage we have of the Old Testament, surely we learn from it, and we can make application to our lives today. Just because we are studying about prophets who are teaching concerning things that are not binding on us, and I'm talking about not living under the Mosaic law, nevertheless, it's teachings we can learn so much from. And so that's what I hope to not only understand what's going on in the minor prophets, such as with Obadiah, but to make application to it. We've studied thus far that the whole book of Obadiah, which is only one chapter long, deals with the destruction of Edom, the descendants of Esau. And I don't know how I got there. Let me change this real quick. All of a sudden, I'm over on another book. We saw that God has already condemned their pride. They had pride in thinking that they were invincible, where they lived, that nobody could touch them, no enemy could bring them down, and God points out that's not the case. And then where we began last week is by looking at the sins of Edom against Israel. Why is God bringing this judgment upon them? It's explained in these verses. Let's read verse 10 down through verse 14, and then we'll go back and make some pertinent comments about it. Obadiah chapter 1, or the only chapter, verse 10. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress. So Obadiah points out specifically some of the sins that they had committed against their brother, and often he uses the concept of family here because, again, I know I've driven this point home many, many times, but Jacob and Esau were brothers, and the people of Edom were the descendants of Esau. What this has reference to, as I understand it, and what other commentaries have suggested as well, is that during the days when Babylon came down and brought captive Judah, the different stages of captivity and the different problems that came upon them. And Edom took advantage of that. They were happy. They were thrilled to see Judah being punished here, and even took advantage of that, plundering their goods and wreaking havoc in their lives. And God said, you're going to suffer for that. All right, before I start looking at the text, I went back and I want us to look at some scriptures here for a moment, or think about some scriptures. All throughout the Bible, God has wanted humans to get along, his people to get along with others. You look back, turn back to Exodus chapter 23 for a moment. Book of Exodus chapter 23. Let's look at verse 4. Exodus 23:4. And I'm reading from the New King James Version here. But the text reads, if your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. Even here, under the Mosaic law, God was saying, you find your enemy, someone that just doesn't like you, and you realize that their donkey, their ox, or whatever is going astray. What did God say to do with that animal? Yeah, take it home. If you find your enemy's ox, today we're carrying a load, we've got a pickup truck, or we've got some other trailer or something like that. Well, they used oxen and donkeys and things like that. Well, if you found that this donkey has fallen underneath the load and can't get up, well, help the man get the animal up. So even in the Mosaic law, from the very beginning, God wanted his people not to, the Hatfields and McCoys here, we're at odds with one another and we hate you and you hate us. That was never God's plan. Jesus said when asked the question about what's the first and great commandment, what did he say? You don't have to quote it, but in essence, what did he say? Love God first and foremost, with all thy heart, soul, mind, and I think Mark adds strength. But the second is like unto it, which was what? Yes. And that really, sometimes I included, I think, in my opinion, I think we all do it, or at least I do it. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. I read over that, or I may even quote that passage. Have you ever stopped to really think about what it means to love your neighbor as yourself? I mean, we try to help ourselves by work and doing this and that, and we're conscious of how we deal with our monies and so on. But yet I'm to love my neighbor the same way. And when you stop and think about just the golden rule, Jesus didn't call it that, we do. Therefore, whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, do you even so unto them. Again, digest that, think about that, break that down. The same way that I want to be treated, I am to treat others. And I haven't always been this way, but anymore as I grow older, especially, and I see more people that I know whose health is bad. If I go to a parking lot, and it's not uncommon that there's a parking place up close to this building, I'll choose one further away, and I'll say somebody else may need that more than I do, because I need to walk. But we're to think about others, to love them as we love ourselves. I challenge you sometime just to look up the word love and see how often Jesus talks about loving the neighbor, loving other people. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have what? Love one to another. And you've heard me, one of the difficulties having me being here this long, both preaching and teaching different times, you can probably finish my thoughts, but it's to me, it's almost like a badge. You have a police officer come, he's wanting to question you about something or whatever, and he shows that, here's this badge, or they'll wear a badge, a sheriff will, or a deputy, and it identifies them. Well, that's what identifies us as Christians. If we have love one to another. We're taught, we read last week from the book of James, how that James said, don't be partial in your treatment concerning the poor, the wealthy. Turn to Romans chapter 13 for a moment. Romans chapter 13. We're going to get back to Obadiah, but I just want us to think and make the application of how we're commanded to love one another. Romans chapter 13, verse 8. Romans 13, verse 8. Paul wrote, O-W-E, owe no man anything except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. Now again, what does it mean to owe? What does it mean? Yeah. What's it mean? And you're right. What's it mean to be in debt, though? I'm obligated, right? Yeah, we've all probably at one time or another had to go and borrow money. Maybe it's for a home, most likely, or an automobile perhaps, and you go and you are obligated. You have as Bobby said, and that's often what we call it, every one of us, it's a debt. But we have an obligation, and we sign our name saying that we will meet the obligation of repayment if it's a physical monetary debt. So we understand what that means. And credit scores are based on, how well we've repaid our debts in monetary means, in the financial realm. But yet here is Paul saying, owe no man anything except to love one another. Here's the obligation that we have. It's a debt. And often we don't think about it in those terms. But we have an obligation to help one another, to love one another. That's something that God placed upon us. Owe no man anything except love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. And he goes on to say, let's not stop reading there. He quotes most of the commandments. Verse 9, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, shall not steal, shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Now I assure you, we've only read just a few passages, mostly from the New Testament here, that love is emphasized. That we are to have that kind of love or compassion toward other people. And when we talk about love, is love an emotion? What is love? Love your neighbor. Well, that means I just feel warm and fuzzy toward my neighbor. What does that mean?
I guess it depends on the kind of love that it is.
The context, sure.
It's interesting how, even from the beginning of time, the is a new commandment, that you love one another as I loved you. They loved each other. They loved themselves. But he said, this is a new commandment. This kind of love. This agape kind of love. Self-sacrificial love. And it's a commanded love. It's not a taught. It is taught love, but it's a commanded love. It's nothing that we have an option. We have to love mankind, whether they be our enemies, like we were talking about, as he saw Jacob. He was expected to love them with agape love. And he could have looked past this thing, but because they didn't have agape love for their brother, then they allowed all these things to happen to Israel, when they did. But I think understood when he's talking about agape love. Then we look past the man and we look at the soul. And that's what we love. And we have to love to that extent, no matter if he's our enemy or whatever. Agape love doesn't recognize enemies. There's something more to a man than this just a being. It's a soul. And I think that's what Jesus done.
Yeah, we love through actions, the things that we can do and so forth. And you mentioned agape love. There's various types of love that are mentioned that are even translated in Scripture. Agape, that Bobby has mentioned, is love with no strings attached. We love not because we glean anything from it, okay? We don't, trying to think of an example here, where we love not expecting anything in return, okay? We love our spouses, we love our children because we gain from that. They love us too. But agape love is actions. Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Love is kind. Love is this. It's about actions, things that we control. And in that sense, we are to help others. Now, when you look back at the people here of Edom and the way they treated Judah, it was just the opposite of that. When Judah fell into trouble with the Babylonians, and yes, God was using Nebuchadnezzar and, of course, the Babylonian Empire to punish Judah because of their sins. They would be led away into captivity for some 70 years. God had it in his plans that they would return to Jerusalem, which they did, rebuild the temple, etc. But yet, here was their neighbor, someone that should be closer than anyone to them because of flesh, because of family ties, and Edom was just the opposite. We'll read other passages here in a moment where they, with glee, with happiness, it's almost like, I'm glad they're getting their, what's coming to them. And it's not just only happiness about it, but even, going in and looting and other things like this. And in instances, when some did try to escape, it was Edom that stood in the way. So again, the very opposite of what God desires his people to be, that of loving one another and helping and kindness and so on. They felt happiness to see another destroyed. We need to be careful because I've seen people have such hatred toward others, much in the same way, that if their house were burning, they would stand and just sing in happiness. If a tragedy happened to them, they were in a bad car wreck, they were hurt, couldn't happen to a better person. And I'm talking about sarcastic, they would say such. So we got to be careful that we all need to learn from this too. So we've seen just in a glimpse here of what the Bible talks about in the way that we are to care for one another, that we are to have this agape love. It is love with no strings attached. Again, we don't give someone a 50, we're making an investment thinking, I'm going to get 100 back from him later. That's not the kind of love this is. And then when we see Edom and their actions, and we see God's response toward them, and that's the benefit for us. Seeing how God views this kind of action. If he viewed Edom that way, if my heart is filled with grudges and hatred towards someone, and again, being happy to see them fall, if you will, in whatever way, that's going to happen to me too. So that's the advantage of going back and studying this book, Obadiah. Any thoughts before we go back and look at the text more closer? All right, let's go back to the book of Obadiah then. Give me just a second here. I've gotten to where I like using this iPad, but I think I am slower than what it would be just turning in the scriptures. Hold your place there in Obadiah. Let's go over now to Psalm 137, and I assure you this ties in. Because here the psalmist is going to give us insight as well into the same event. Psalm 137, verse 1. We're going to read some 7 verses here. All right. Psalm 137, verse 1. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remember Zion. What is Zion? Yeah, it's another word for Jerusalem. Okay? So here was the psalmist, and you got to remember, at least in my understanding, here's the psalmist, prophetically, as if this event had already happened. He's looking back. If David wrote this, he wrote it prophetically, realizing that Jerusalem was going to fall, and these events, and that makes this, to me, even more amazing. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hung our harps upon the willows in the midst of it. For there those who carried us away captive asked of us a song. And those who plundered us requested mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. So David is viewing this, and he's saying, even when they were carrying away captives, we were mourning, but they were saying, Sing us a song. Verse 4. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Now look at verse 7. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. The word raise here in the context carries with it the idea of exposing it, destroy it, if you will, lay it bare is the idea. And here's the psalmist looking back as if this is already, it hadn't even happened yet. But he's viewing it as if it's historical, if that's what's going to happen. He can see that, and he says, remember Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation, bring it down, destroy it. And the psalmist said, remember Edom. So even the psalmist, even David, is remembering this event as if it's already happened. And again, the actions of Edom. There's many other prophets, believe it or not, that also mentions Edom, but we're going to leave it at that, I promise you. And we're going to go back now to the text, unless you have some comments you'd like to make. All right. Go ahead, Ted.
Just makes me think of God's time is not our time.
That's very true.
David's writing about it as if it already happened. In the great scheme of things, I mean, it was already present. It was already going to be fulfilled.
And I think it's valuable for us as we read the scriptures to remember God is the same today, yesterday. In other words, the time, it's immutable. God is immutable. God doesn't view it as we would. Yes, you're right. And to see I think it helps me to understand the nature of God more. That here's David writing upon something that hadn't even happened yet. And yet, of course, now it's history. But it wasn't when the days of David wrote it. But he knew those things. And I'm not making sense, perhaps, but again, it is amazing. Okay, Obadiah, back to chapter 1, verse 10. We'll break this down verse by verse a little bit. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. What is shame? Shame shall cover you. What is that?
Disgrace.
All right, disgrace is, I think, a good synonym for that. You've seen someone who's been shamed, and often they have their head, down. I remember, and by the way, Ted, you got to bring up an example here in a minute from last week. But I remember having read about World War II. If you remember, whenever Germany, of course, they went into Poland first, and that's really what kicked off World War II. They went in and invaded Poland, and then later, of course, from there, France, and took France. Some of the French people willingly helped the Germans, thinking that, okay, we've been overrun, we've got to make friends of these Germans or we're going to be destroyed. And I remember seeing pictures after the fact, whenever the Allies landed on Normandy and liberated France and then made their way into Germany, and seeing that the French people who knew so many of their peers who had began to help Germany. I remember seeing the pictures of women. This isn't very, it's just history. But they were so mad at some of the women for helping the Nazis that they shaved them bald and they stripped them of their clothes and made them walk down the street in shame. Now, how do you think, you can imagine their posture, meaning, their heads were held down in shame as people ridiculed them as they were forced to walk down the streets, much like a gauntlet, if you will, because they had given aid to the enemy. So that's shame. And Obadiah, God is saying to Obadiah, the people of Obadiah, I should say, you're going to be held in shame for your actions. And as Ted said, it's God's time frame of punishment is not always immediate like we sometimes think of it, but it was going to happen, and he pointed that out.
Well, it's not immediate in our time.
Correct.
But it is immediate in God's time.
That's a good point. All right, and he said, you're going to be cut off forever. This isn't, your very existence is going to end, and it's going to be forever. And he's talking about physical existence as a nation. And historically, the country of Edom doesn't exist today. I challenge you to go back and read some of the other commentaries that deal with the end of Edom, and it happened in degrees, as I understand it, mostly during the interbiblical period, as I mentioned last week. That there's some period of 400 years between the last prophet of the Old Testament and, of course, the writings of Matthew, or the beginning of John the Baptist. I shouldn't say the writings of Matthew. When John the Baptist was born 6 months earlier than Jesus, and so on. 400 years was mainly during the time frame of Edom's destruction. The last and perhaps the only great thing, and that's not a great thing, that they would have gave rise to the Herods. And I think Tom mentioned that in one of our discussions several weeks ago, and he was right about that. You were right about that, Tom. It did have to do with the Herods. The Herod dynasty came from the people of Edom. It was not much to brag about, but it was kind of the end of their the destruction as a nation. Okay, verse 11. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. When the Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar, when he came and began to take away captives, deport people out of Jerusalem, you were there with them. You were giving them support. You were happy this was happening. As I said, it's almost as if they were happy, and they were happy at the destruction of their neighbor. Instead of feeling sorrow for them, no, it was just the opposite. I am thankful that our nation has been one that has risen to occasions where other people, certainly in the States, when we had the floods here, people came from everywhere to help. I saw that out in the field working. I remember once I got a call to go down in western Washington County, down along Nolichucky. This guy had lost his house, and I was there to open up some safes. The water had destroyed the electronics of the safes. But I remember there, I was knocking on this lady's door, and this guy pulls up. He's in a big truck, and he's got a box van behind his truck. And he said, "Where do I go to help?" He was from Ohio. And I said, "Sir, I have no idea." I said, "This lady," and when she answered the door, told me, actually she called her brother, and he was coming up to get me, couldn't even get a vehicle to where this house was. The road was washed away. They had to take me in, but with a side-by-side utility vehicle. But she was telling him, "Well, you might go so-and-so, and they probably need help." But I'm glad that people cared. Other countries, the states, the U.S. has given aid to other countries, has gone through certain natural disasters and so on. Well, here, instead of helping, instead of having compassion, I know I'm going over and over this, but that's what happened. Okay? Even you were as one of them. Verse 12. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. What a rotten attitude. He said you shouldn't have done that. Verse 13, you should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. We've already discussed in times past where, basically they were looting. And I mentioned before that if along the coast there's a hurricane and people are evacuated, the National Guard is sometimes called in to keep people from looting their neighbor. How terrible. Taking advantage of another person's problems and stealing from them. One of the things, I don't know if you kept up with this, maybe because I was out when the flood happened, but there were some people who were out below houses that had been washed away, and they were going through the debris looking for guns and other things like that, and some of the local people were so angry. And they had called the police, and they'd had certain groups arrested, but it was because, it's not your stuff. How they viewed it. Well, it's washed away. No, neighbors were still out looking for their items that had been washed away. A house and belongings that literally were, probably 95% of it they'd never find. But here were other people out just looking for, something they might take for nothing because of the tragedy that happened. And I heard one man, I'll shoot him if I find him. I mean, he was that angry, not only from the loss, but people who were taking advantage of that, looking for heirlooms. In other words, he said, my grandfather's gun was washed away and someone out, I better not find somebody with it. I mean, that was his attitude. But we can understand the strong emotions it would bring about. Verse 14, you should have not stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress. So they were aiding and abetting. They were helping. Individuals who did try to flee the tragedy were being helped. I mean, the people of Edom were helping make sure they had the ultimate destruction. All right, I think I've beat that to death. Any comments you want to make as we go on here? I'm not going to spend a great deal of time the rest of this. The next section, the day of the Lord is near. We don't have much time, but let's read over this. For the day of the Lord upon all the nations is near. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your reprisal shall return upon your own head. And what passage of the New Testament, which I've mentioned many times, does that remind you of? Read it again. The day, judgment of the Lord upon all the nations here. As you've done, it shall be done to you. Your reprisal shall return upon your own head. What's God's universal law of reaping and sowing? That's what he's saying here. As you've done it to them, it's going to be done to you. We ought to remember that verse. As I said earlier in classes, that was drilled into my feeble brain when I was in school. God's universal law. As you've done it to them, it's going to be done to you. It'll return to your own head. Verse 16, for as you drink on my holy mountain, so shall all the nations drink continually. Yes, they shall drink and swallow, and they shall be as though they had never been. If I understand this passage correctly, during the day of triumph, often the victors would drink and they would celebrate their victory. Again, I mentioned, go back to France, and whenever, the Allies came and as they liberated France, we've seen videos, old black and white videos and pictures of the French people bringing out wine and other things they're celebrating their liberty. Well, often the victors would celebrate. And if I understand it, for as you drank on my holy mountain, as you celebrated the destruction of Jerusalem, just as you celebrated, what's going to happen when the judgment comes? All these nations around you, whom you think are your friends, we talked about that in the earlier part of the book, they're going to be the ones that bring you down, and they're going to drink in celebration over your land. Okay? All right, verse 17. But on Mount Zion there shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness. The house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. Again, what's Mount Zion? Yeah, Jerusalem. All he was saying is, you think Jerusalem was being destroyed. You rejoiced and did everything in helping their demise, but it's Jerusalem that's going to prosper. It's going to prosper. You're going to fall down. You're going to be brought down. You're going to be judged. Jerusalem is going to be delivered. Verse 18, the house of Jacob shall be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame. The house of Esau shall be stubble. They shall kindle them and devour them, and no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. All he's saying is God's people is going to be victorious. Edom, you're going to be destroyed. Now, before our class ends, in a time, if that clock is fairly correct, it'll be just about over. After the class last week, Ted came up to me and he said, it reminds me of a particular example. And I said, Ted, yeah, you're exactly right. And the way that Edom treated Judah. Ted, why don't you explain what you did to me, what you said to me?
Just reminded me of neighbors back to World War II, when places were invaded and the Jews were run out of their homes. Their neighbors stood there and cheered and threw rocks at them and spat on them. And then I didn't think about it at the time. Then, you know what? They went back to their homes and their apartments and they took their things. They very often did that. And then, of course, later, they're going to end up like the Vichy government and the people of France that you were talking about. I mean, people use, the phrase, what goes around comes around, which doesn't always work to people's satisfaction. They want instant karma or whatever. But this is a perfect example. God sees what you did. God sees saw how you treated your fellow man, and your love to be right, powerful, or wealthy, or whatever, overwhelmed your right to be decent and treat your fellow man with decency.
Yeah. Somewhat as a historian, meaning I enjoy the history of the World War II era, Ted is just spot on. The way that the neighbors around the Jewish community, when they were carted off to boxcars and taken to concentration camp, they did rejoice. They didn't help them. Now, on a few occasions, we read that they did, but for the most part, they didn't. And we see the tragic results. Then, when the Allies bombed Berlin to rubble, and of course the Allies came in, whose homes were plundered? It was the Germans, and they were homeless, and it very much came back to them. All right, thank you for the class participation. We will complete this next week, and then we're going to go on to the next book, which, again, we're not doing this in chronological order. I think it's the book of Jonah that we're going to be studying next. But we'll finish this up next week. Thank you for your participation, and listen to me as I ramble through some other background material.